welcome you once again to the Upper Room. Great to be with you. Now, in the last lesson we did on John chapter 14, I made you a promise, and I got to begin today by telling you I broke that promise. I hate to do that, but that's the reality. I made you a promise that I would allow enough time. In other words, I would make the lesson short enough that you would have plenty of time to process those 12 promises, if you remember those from John chapter 14, and I didn't do that. It was kind of a typical lesson in length, and it has really bugged me since doing that. So guess what? We're going to go back to those 12 promises, because I actually think that those 12 promises that we find in John chapter 14 could actually be life-changing. That's how important they are. I'm not going to go all the way back through all 12 promises, but what I want to do is remind you of them and then briefly give you a tool by which you could process those promises in terms of actually learning how to live those promises. Now, we'll get into the tool a lot in just a bit, but just so you know, I've taught on this tool before. It's a tool that I was given when I was in high school, and I've used it all these years that really has helped me understand how to eventually live out what I say I believe. And all that to say, I'm promising again to give you plenty of time, ample opportunity to process together in your community. And if you're not in a small faith community, find a friend, find somebody to watch this with and process what Jesus said in the upper room in John chapter 14. In fact, I'm going to make that an assignment. All right? You can't get out of it. I don't think I expect too much from you too often, but I do expect that you will spend the time. It may take 30, 45 minutes, an hour to process what it is that we found in John 14. But I want you to do that, because ultimately the upper room is not about lessons. The upper room is about community, faith community, and it is about being changed, our lives being changed into the image of Christ. And maybe you've forgotten that that's what it's about. So let me remind you of how essential it is that our lives are changed into the likeness of Christ. And if that's not happening, what really would be the point of this? You know, I would hate to think that you just think these lessons that we do in the upper room are interesting. My hope and my prayer, our desire, is that you find these helpful in your journey of your life being changed into the image of Christ. So a couple passages just in case you've forgotten, or maybe you never believed that that's what this is all about. Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 and 29 read this way. Jesus says, "Come to me." It's an invitation. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened." I think that's all of us, right? That's why he started the way he did in John 14:1. "Let not your heart be troubled." Okay, so here he says, come to me if you ever experience being weary or burdened, and I will give you rest. Isn't that a great promise? Now watch this, verse 29. "Take my yoke upon you." Now you remember what a yoke is, right? It's that tool, if you will, that they would place on oxen or donkeys or cows to help them work together to plow a field or whatever. It really was about partnership, not leaving the work to be done on one animal, but the shared responsibility and partnership. That's what he's inviting us into. So Jesus, number one, says, come. If you're tired, I'll give you rest. Number two, he's inviting us to do life with him. It really is a partnership. And that's the key to it all, is that, yes, we live for him, but we live with him. He lives with us. You know that by now. And that's the beauty of a walk with Christ. So then again, he finishes in verse 29 this way, "Take my yoke upon you," partner with me, and here it is, "and learn from me." That's the invitation, that we learn from him. And he finishes by saying, "For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls, which we all need. Okay, so the goal here in the invitation is I'll do life with you, but the whole point is that you learn from me. And the question is, how do we do that? How do we learn from Jesus, specifically as it relates to what we read in John chapter 14? I don't know if, as you came to faith and that journey you began, if anybody explained to you that it's an awful lot about learning, but it is, and that brings us to our location. We're in front of a schoolhouse that was built in 1919. It's called Pea Green. I've joked about Pea Green as a little spot in the road, and this truly is a little spot in the road. Now, the original schoolhouse, what we learned was that when they built it, they wanted to paint it, and so the government came in and issued them the paint, and the paint was the color of green peas. And so you have Pea Green Schoolhouse, and then it became obviously what we see behind us, this beautiful stone-built house, and now folks actually live in here. We just met them, and wonderful people who, this is not the first schoolhouse they have lived in. The question is, did kids really learn here? We assume they did. Do you remember anything you learned in elementary school or middle school or high school? I don't remember a whole lot, to be honest with you. In middle school, I learned how to bake and to sew, which was part of basic survival class. So I can survive if we need some cookies or a little animal pillow. But in high school, I don't remember a lot about what I learned. Maybe you did. But did we really learn? Did the kids who attended school out here in the middle of nowhere, Pea Green, Colorado, did they learn? We're going to get into that, whether or not you know whether or not you're learning. Because if we're really not learning from Jesus, what is the point of getting together and listening to the words of Jesus if we're not truly learning from Jesus? As you may know by now, hopefully you do know that learning is just a part of the ultimate goal for us. The ultimate goal is to glorify God, and the greatest way we can glorify God is to become like His Son. A couple of passages to remind you about that. 1 John chapter 2, verse 6. Whoever claims to live in Him must live as He did. You know, that means you don't have to wear a robe and a tunic and sandals, but there was a way He lived that we want to mold our life into. Another passage, Ephesians 5:1. Imitate God, therefore, in everything you do, because you are His dear children. Live a life filled with love, following the example of Christ. So how we live, learning to live, is about learning to live as He would live our lives if He had our lives to live. He is the example, He's the prototype, He's the model. And that's what our life becomes all about. And then finally in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21, Peter writes, He, meaning Christ, is your example, and you must follow in His steps. Okay, famous book was written at one time by Sheldon that talked about following in His steps. That's what our lives are about. How can I emulate the life of Jesus in the life that I have? And so the necessity that we have before us is that we learn to live our lives as Jesus would live our lives if He had our lives to live, right? To live like Christ. Discussion question, and this will be the only one before you get your big homework assignment. The discussion question is this. So what is your plan? What is your plan to learn how to live as Jesus would live if He had your life to live? Do you have a plan? Most people I know do not have a plan. The kids here over 100 years ago, at least their parents had a plan. Now, whether it worked or not, I don't know. But that's what today is about, is to provide you with a plan by which you can actually learn to live for Christ and become like Him. Now, as I said, most supposed Christians or followers of Christ that I know have no real plan as to how to pull that out. You know, if I want to become an engineer or a lawyer or something like that, a doctor, say, there's a plan that I need to follow. It might have variations from what other people follow, but there's a basic plan. Nobody would just say, well, I'm just going to sit around and wait for it to happen to me. Too many of us as followers of Christ say, well, I guess it'll just happen. No, we've got to have a plan, and that's what we will talk about. There is a statement I want to give you, and I'm going to ask you to jot it down, because I believe this is what it's about. There are a lot of misunderstandings about what it means to follow Christ. So here you go. This is what I believe it means to follow Christ. Anyone who claims to follow Jesus must be committed to continually learning to live in compliance to Jesus' commands. So in the last lesson, we began in chapter 14, verse 1 of John. The first part said, do not let your hearts be troubled. Most of us don't see that as a command, but it is. I'm telling you, you're not to live a life of anxiety and depression and being bothered by the things of this world. He's saying that to his disciples in the upper room, but by ripple effect, it is to us as well, right? And again, you remember, they had reason to be upset. They had reason to be worried. They had reason to be disturbed, to be stirred, as the word actually means, to be troubled, because what they thought they had signed up for doesn't appear to be coming true. In fact, they're going to have to live without Jesus around. And they had left their homes and families and jobs, occupations, hobbies to follow him. And now they just found out he's going to die on a cross. And they were troubled. And that's why he says, don't be troubled. Really. And then I told you, I saw something I've never seen before. After he says that, what I found is 12 promises that will support us in that effort to live as he lived. And that is to not live lives where we are filled with stress and anxiety because of these promises that we claim. Now, we tend to forget promises, and so we frame those as things we should remember. Ideas, promises, a focus that we should remember. And so today will be about how then shall we remember those things. Once again, I don't want you to miss it. The goal is that our lives are changed, that we're not the same people we were a year ago, even a month ago. But certainly our lives have changed, and if they have not, we have to ask the question whether or not we're really following Christ. The most obvious passage of Scripture that we can refer to here is Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Do not be conformed to the pattern of this world. Can you say stress? I talked about that book, The Anxious Generation. This generation, not just the Gen Z, but our entire culture is stressed. So we're not to live that way. We're not to conform our lives to a stressful life filled with those anxieties. And yet he goes on and says, but instead, don't do this, which everybody tends to do. Instead, be transformed. Remember, that's the morph. You shall morph like a caterpillar morphs into a butterfly. You shall be transformed by the renewing of your mind. You're going to have to think differently. And that's why I want to give you a tool. Changing the way we think is really challenging, isn't it? If we could change the way we think, our entire lives would change. And that's what Paul's writing in Romans 12. You will be transformed by the way you change the way you think, by the renewing of your mind. And then he finishes that verse this way. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Everybody wants to know God's will. Everybody that says they're Christian, at least we say we want to know God's will. But the only way you're going to know God's will is if your mind is being renewed and you have a way to learn and grow into the likeness of God's Son. And then one more passage, 2 Corinthians 3:18, and we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory. We all think about the greatness of God, don't we? So what should we do with that? Paul writes and says, well, this is what you do with it. We are being transformed into his image with ever increasing glory, which comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. The Spirit plays the major role in transforming us into the image of Christ. That's the goal. Okay, the question then, much like I asked last week when it came to do not be troubled, do not let your hearts be troubled, the question is how? How do we not do that? And then he followed up with 12 promises. The goal today is how do we learn? How do we have our lives changed? How are we transformed into the image of Jesus? Good question. I've got that tool for you, and I'm going to give it to you here in just a moment. Now this tool will be a very practical extension of 1 Timothy chapter 4 verses 7 and 8, where Paul wrote to Timothy and said, train yourself to godliness. Physical training, going to Gold's Gym, is fine, but that's not what we're after. Train yourself to godliness. How will I do that? I'm going to need some help in that training. If I train myself for anything else, right, to be a doctor, to be a lawyer, to be anything else, I've got to be trained. This tool, I believe, will help you with the training process. Let me give you the acronym for this tool. And by the acronym, you'll be able to remember it, I believe, what this tool is. And again, I taught on this, probably 2 or 3 years ago. But instead of trying to get you to go back and find that, I'm going to give it to you brand new, very fresh. This is something that's been life-changing for me, and I know there's some of the leaders in the house churches in the upper room who have found this life-changing as well. Here is your acronym, ARC Magi. ARC Magi. Let's go through it very quickly. So when it comes to the first A in the acronym ARC Magi, is A for awareness. Most of us think that when we become aware of something, we have learned it. That's the furthest thing from the truth. The R in ARC Magi is to recognize it. Whatever it is, whatever it is you say you want to learn, your goal is to learn that, you must become aware of it, first of all, and then you must recognize it. When you see it pop up again, I can recognize it. The gal that lives here was saying that kids actually wrote in the bricks on the side, outside of the schoolhouse, arithmetic lessons. They wanted to be able to recognize it when they saw it. So the R stands for recognition. The C stands for comprehension, to comprehend, to understand. So whatever it is we're talking about, do you understand it? Really, what does it mean? So understanding or comprehension is the C of ARC Magi. The M is memorization. That's pretty simple. If I'm ever going to learn anything, at some point I've got to commit it to memory. This is something we're not big fans of, but in reality, we have memorized an awful lot. When a song from the 70s comes on, I'm shocked at how many of the words I remember because I memorized them through repetition. Memorization, whatever it is you're wanting to learn, must be committed to memory. Now the second A of ARC Magi is application. How does this apply in my life? What would it look like if I put it into my life? Again, we're just thinking about these things, right? How does that fit into my life? That's the A, the application of ARC Magi. Okay, to review, we become aware of something. We can recognize it. We can understand it, comprehend it. We've committed it to memory. And we found ways to apply it to our lives. Now it gets interesting. The G stands for generalization. And what that means is that I generally can actually do that thing sometimes. I don't do it all the time, but I found ways to actually do that thing. Whatever it is we're talking about learning, I can actually do that, right? Love your enemies. Sound familiar? I've actually found ways to do that. I don't do it all the time, but sometimes I can find ways to live it out. And now we come to the end of ARC Magi, and that is the I, which stands for internalization. What that means is my very nature has been changed. I have been transformed. And now I do that thing, whatever that is that I want to learn, I do that all the time without even thinking about it. It's second nature. It is then and only then that I can say that I have truly learned that. What it means is my life is different. And that's the evidence that I've learned, whatever that is that I'm wanting to learn. Okay, so what we do now is we take ARC Magi as a tool and we apply it to the words of Jesus. All right, I shared with you in the last lesson there are 12 ideas, 12 promises. So what you're going to do, this is going to be hard work, but you're up to it. You're going to take each promise, go back to those. I'm not going to review them for you. Go back to each promise and then take it through the ARC Magi tool of learning. Have you really learned? And I believe if you have, if you can say that even with some of those promises, I've actually learned that, my life has been changed by it, then Jesus' command to do not let your hearts be troubled is actually something I'm living. My heart is not troubled anymore. Isn't that great stuff? I think you got this, right? You can do this. The question is, will you commit to it? And will you truly believe that your life changing is what it means to follow Jesus? And when your life is changed to be more like Jesus, God is honored, He's glorified, and we have fulfilled our purpose here on earth. The topic is the anxiousness of being a human. Jesus brought it up in John 14, and now He gives His disciples, who that includes us now, 2,000 years later, some ways to accomplish do not be troubled. Let's start with the first one. I'll do the first one with you. Do not be troubled. Do not let your heart be troubled, verse 1 says. And then the second part of verse 1 says, trust in God, trust also in me. So if I'm going to use this tool, the question becomes, where am I on that journey of trusting God? Is it something I'm just aware of, or I can recognize it? I'm sure you recognize the need for us to trust God. It's a command from Him. Have you memorized it? I bet you have. I bet you might even know the Greek word for believe. Pisteuo, right? Say it with me. That means you have memorized this reality that part of my responsibility in following Jesus is to put my life in His hands, to absolutely rely, be confident in, trust Him. The question now becomes, have you found out how to apply that to your life, and are you doing it? And ultimately, has it become your second nature? You trust God, you trust the Lord so much that it's changed everything about you. So that's how that works. Now you've got 11 more. Of course, you can go back to that one we just covered, but you could talk about that all day long, right? But you have 12 in total, 12 ideas to focus on, and now a tool to show whether or not you really are learning to live the words of Jesus or not. Interesting, right? Fascinating, challenging. I hope you're challenged. And now, in just a moment, I'm going to give you 45 minutes to an hour, whatever you want to take. You have the time now to actually learn to be like Jesus based on what He taught us and what I'm willing to do with that. Last night, Christy and Caleb and myself watched the documentary about Apollo 11. Apollo 11 was the first group of men to go into space and stand on the moon. Okay, and so I was a young man. I remember it. The whole world was watching. And what this documentary was about, it wasn't just about the footage of them doing that, but in fact, they found footage in their archives of other things that they did in preparation for their journey to the moon. And that was really fascinating. They took every possible scenario that they might face in their journey, and they tried to figure out, what would we do? And the word they used was, we trained. For example, one of the most fascinating parts of that for me was they had to think about the fact that their goal was to splash down in the ocean when they returned, but what if they missed? What if they hit the desert? What if they hit a jungle? So they actually went and took these astronauts to the desert, took them to the jungle, and they learned how to survive if they missed their mark and no one found them for a few days. Isn't that great stuff? They practiced everything like that. They trained so that they would be able to get to the moon, stand on the moon, and return back home. They trained for that. They knew we need a plan. I want to leave you with this. The training you and I need to undertake is of something of much greater importance than standing on the moon. I mean, you watch that documentary and go, that was really important that they know how to do these things to get to the moon and back. What you and I are undertaking at this moment in our lives is of such greater value than standing on the moon. Because what we are training for is to walk with the God of the universe and to become like His Son. I'm telling you, as famous as those guys are from Apollo 11, from 1969, what we're attempting, what we're looking at doing in our lives is of much greater value. Walking with God is the greatest thing you could ever do. Becoming like the Son of God is really what our lives are all about. Okay, so there it is. I don't know how long this has taken, but I know you have more time now. So I expect you to go back. John 14, go through that process with those 12 promises through the Ark Magi. I pray that that tool will be something you can use the rest of your life to know actually whether or not I'm learning. the astronauts returned home and could testify as to the journey. Would you be able to testify as to the journey that you've taken with Jesus? I pray you are. Thanks for joining us in Pea Green, Colorado. And I don't know what learning went on there, but I know what learning is even more important, the learning we're about. It's great to be with you. Thanks for joining us. We love you, love doing the journey with you, a journey of growth and transformation to Christ-likeness. God bless you all.